Programs online at booktv.org.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. Michael Medved is a radio show host, an author, and a film critic. He's the former chief film critic for the New York Post, not Seattle, and co-host of PBS's weekly film review program, Sneak Previews. He currently hosts a daily radio program, The Michael Medved Show, which airs on over 300 stations across the country and reaches 5 million listeners. He's also written 13 books, including the bestsellers Hollywood vs. America and The 10 Big Lies About America. His latest book is The American Miracle, Divine Providence in the Rise of the Republic. Please join me in welcoming Michael Medved.
Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for coming out. But I want to begin by anticipating 3 questions that are inevitable. They're going to come up anyway, so let's deal with them right now. Question number 1, which I actually will get to at the end. Question number 1 is you'll pardon the expression, elephant in the room. It is the obvious question, and something that I wasn't expecting to have to deal with when I set out to write this book. The question is, okay, you, Medved, argue in The American Miracle, Divine Providence in the Rise of the Republic. You argue, Medved, that there is special protection, special blessing for the United States of America. And yes, I do. I emphatically agree with Otto von Bismarck, the Eisenkanzler, the Iron Chancellor, the guy who really welded together the modern German state. In 1898, Chancellor Bismarck said, God gives special protection to imbeciles, drunkards, lost dogs, and the United States of America. He recognized it. Generations of scholars have recognized it. But how can we recognize that special protection in a season when we have just experienced a presidential election with the 2 least popular candidates ever? Ever! I mean, the disapproval ratings for Secretary Clinton and for President-elect Trump were sky high. Now, there's no doubt. President-elect Trump has momentum. He has been rising in the polls. There is much greater approval. But rising in the polls, do you know that he just won an election, right? His approval rating just skyrocketed all the way to 50%. Now, it's much better. It was down in the 20s at one point. But still, if God protects America, if the will of history protects this country, how did we end up with this particular election where virtually everyone I know, whichever side you ended up on, was agonized and wringing hands about the decision and about the process and what's happening to our country? How'd that happen? Question number 2 is much more straightforward, and you hear that all the time. And that is, how is it that you ended up writing this particular book? What was it about the topic that sang to you, that got you to do this book? We'll get to that. And the third question is, let's say there's a skeptic out there, and there probably are skeptics here tonight, who say, okay, this is just coincidence. The stuff that you write about in The American Miracle really isn't so miraculous. It's just a bunch of random circumstance that fits together. In fact, the very first, we've been very fortunate. We actually got into official bestseller territory over at Amazon today. And the reviews on Amazon have been basically all 5-star reviews. First hostile review appeared yesterday. And the guy made precisely that point. He said, I disagree with Medved because basically what he's talking about is easily explained. You don't have to use any kind of supernatural ooh to explain it. It's just lucky. It's just fortunate it happens. Okay, and by the way, a more sympathetic party wrote back in response to his review, and people can go back and forth like that on Amazon, said, you obviously didn't read the book, which he didn't, because Medved anticipates that argument, but the truth is he acknowledged in a response, decently enough, that no, he only read the sample chapter that you can get on the website. Oh, yeah. I mean, so he's going to try to take down the book without even buying it. That's a terrible thing. In any event, we will get to that third question as well. So let me take the middle question first, which really should have been the first one in order, but I wanted to get the first one out there and then come around at the end to close the circle and then open it to your questions. First question, what was it about this book, about this topic, about this subject, about this line of argument that was so compelling to me? It really has to do with family history. I did this book in part in memory to my late father. My father was an American miracle. And he really was. I'll tell you the story. My grandfather came to this country in 1910. He was a barrel maker. He never went to school. And when I say never went to school, he never went to school. I mean, Lincoln went to school a total of 6 months and ended up being arguably the best prose stylist in the history of the English language. My grandfather never fully learned English. He spoke Yiddish. He was from Ukraine. He lived in a tiny little town called Machnivka. He was originally from a town called Chmelnik. I know it all sounds like you're clearing your throat, and it's one of the great things about Yiddish names, at least Yiddish pronunciations of Ukrainian names from Ukraine. In any event, my grandfather comes to Philadelphia in 1910, and he has a plan. And his plan is basically, is that better? Okay. And his plan is basically that he is going to work long enough and earn enough money to send money home so that his wife, my grandmother, and her 6 children can actually make it across the ocean and join him in Philadelphia. And that takes a lot of work and saving when you're working as a barrel maker to be able to do that. And what happened was, and again, this is family lore. I grew up with this and then had the opportunity to check it, and it really is true. You can check the shipping records, all of that. My grandmother, with the 6 children, and her father, started out and started riding the train, and they're riding the train through Ukraine and to the border with what was then Germany, and they arrived at the beginning of August in 1914. And war had just broken out, World War I, and they weren't allowed to cross the border because they were suddenly enemy aliens. The bloodiest front of that war, arguably, of course, was between Russia and Germany and Austria. So back they go, they ride the train all the way back, and during the course of the war, the Russian Revolution, 3 years later, and then the Russian Civil War, which lasted 6 more years. The Russian Civil War did not end until 1923. They are struggling far away, separated from my grandfather, and 5 of my father's sisters, they were all girls, died. One survivor, my Uncle Moish. And finally in 1924, they got out. They came to America. My uncle was 20. My grandmother was in her late 40s. And my grandfather was just turned 50. And they came to Philadelphia, they reunited, and it was tearful. And can you imagine, separated for 10 years, having lost 5 children and buried 5 children. And then the tragedy is that my grandmother got sick right away when she came here. And she was terribly worried because they had no money, they couldn't pay for doctors, and she couldn't keep down her food. She was absolutely convinced there was a tumor in her digestive tract because she couldn't eat and she couldn't keep food down, and she felt this thing growing. And she went to see a physician, a doctor. It's actually my Uncle Isaac. And he examined her, and she was tearful. My grandmother, who I knew, was a very tearful person. She could, as they say, she could cry on a good piece of chicken. I mean, she liked to cry. She had bright blue eyes, by the way, like my wonderful wife. In any event, so Uncle Isaac examines her. And so they sit down together, and she's crying, and she says, do you want me to tell you what it is? And she cries, yes, yes, it's a tumor, isn't it? He says, no, it's not a tumor, it's a baby. And she says, that's not possible. It can't be a baby. I've been away from my husband, I'm in my late 40s. She says, basically, I am, as they say in the Bible, not in the way of women. And the doctor, Uncle Isaac, smiles and says, well, your name is Sarah, isn't it? And it was. And the baby was my father, the American Miracle. His nickname in South Philadelphia, really, 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 and I knew people who still referred to my dad this way. His nickname was Tumoral, which means little tumor. Because this was neighborhood lore. Everybody knew Sarah Medved had a tumor, and the tumor turned into my dad. And my dad, growing up in South Philly with people who had never been to school, was kind of a star in school, and he won the mayor's scholarship in Philadelphia, and then he fought for the U.S. Navy in the war, and then he got out of the war, and he went to the University of Pennsylvania in Philly, and undergraduate and 2 master's degrees and a PhD in physics, and he was in the scientist-astronaut program, and he had an amazing life, just amazing life. And the one thing that he never, ever shied away from was a sense of wonder and blessing and destiny about his parents coming to this country. He's the first American-born child. And he was conceived right after my grandmother came in to the United States of America. This land of new life, this land of fresh starts, this amazing, blessed, spectacular land. My dad was 22 when I was born. And he used to take me around in Philadelphia to historic sites, to Independence Hall, where both the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I write a great deal about the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention and the miracle of that convention. It's in the book. And he infused in me the idea that this is amazing stuff. He took me out to Valley Forge. And I remember my dad used to he'd do word pictures. He'd say, oh, this is where George Washington was on his big horse. And I was like 4 years old, you know. And he'd say, and those men, they didn't have uniforms and they didn't have shoes. And you know what happens when it's really cold and it's the snow and you're walking on the snow? He says, you leave bloody footprints on the snow. Now, this grossed me out completely. When you're a little kid, of course it does, but it also, you remember it. And this sense of gratitude toward this country that made my father's life possible, to go from an unschooled barrel maker to being a successful physicist, scientist, business entrepreneur, academic. He taught at UCLA. All of this is one of the reasons, even during periods of my life, even during periods of my dad's life, when we weren't particularly religious. I became more religiously involved as an adult. My dad became a Sabbath observer for the first time in his 50s, and after his sons had already gotten involved. But before that, even that, he had no doubt. I never had any doubt. I wasn't raised with any doubt. There was something special unique, distinctive about America. And if you have that sense, you love history. Because it's not just a bunch of irrelevant stories. It's not just a bunch of accusations that are supposed to make you feel guilty. It's a series of miracles to make you feel grateful. And that's the impulse that led me to write this book. And it's something that I've always tried to pass on to our own 3 children, that I've tried to communicate in the radio show, that history, it's Faulkner's great quote. Faulkner writes, the past isn't dead. The past isn't even past. And that's exactly the point. We need to live with this sense of gratitude for the amazing existence of this country and the survival of this country. The other question, before we get to the question about how could a God who protects the United States and imbeciles and lost dogs and drunkards and small children, how could that God allow a choice between Trump and Clinton? We'll get to that in just a moment. The other question was, okay, how do you argue that this is not just coincidence? And what's fascinating to me is that basically the fellow who did the negative review on Amazon, and I'm focused on it, focused on what actually is, to me, the most obviously bizarre, strange story with which I open the book. And it's a story that many of you know, and it's a story of one day, one remarkable 24-hour day in 1826. July 4th, 1826. It's the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, of the beginning of this great country, and people being very biblically literate at that time, and most Americans at that time were religious at least in one form or another. There was a sense that this is the biblical Jubilee. In the Bible, you have every 50 years, you have Yovel as the Hebrew word, Jubilee is the translated word, and you are supposed to proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof, and that in fact is the inscription on the Liberty Bell. And people are getting ready to celebrate this great Jubilee year, this grand Jubilee of July 4th, 1826, 50 years of America. Our population has quadrupled. The country has gone from a straggling little group of thinly settled colonies into basically an economic and even military powerhouse in a very short order. And people are celebrating, and they're celebrating partially because the 2 great giants who had allowed that Declaration of Independence to come into existence, the guy who fought for it and argued for it relentlessly at the Continental Congress, his name was John Adams. He was 90 years old, and he was alive and well, and his son was in the White House as President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. Amazing. Similarly amazing, Thomas Jefferson, the guy who Adams had chosen to write this declaration because he recognized that Jefferson was the best writer of the 50 people who were there in the Continental Congress. Jefferson was also alive. Of 55 people who fixed their names to that declaration, only 3 were still living. John Carroll was old in Maryland, plus Adams and Jefferson. Imagine both presidents of the United States. Jefferson's 83, Adams is 90. The typical life expectancy at the time is 20 years less than that, much more than 20 years less. And people thought we were incredibly fortunate. John Adams dies that night, on July 4th. And reportedly his last words were, "Jefferson survives." But he didn't. Jefferson died actually 6 hours earlier. The only 2 presidents to die on the same day. Okay, so this guy who writes in says, wait a minute. November 22nd, 1963, the British novelist Aldous Huxley dies and John F. Kennedy dies. So what? By the way, you'll pardon the expression, trump that. Also on November 22nd, 1963, C.S. Lewis died. So you've got three biggies, but what's the connection between Aldous Huxley and C.S. Lewis and John Kennedy? This is like a joke. I mean, it's like three guys, a British novelist and a great theological thinker and a president of the United States walk into the bar. And they have nothing in common. Jefferson and Adams have everything in common. And by the way, November 22nd, 1963 was just another day until that death happened, the death of John Kennedy. July 4th, 1826 was a special day even before the two giants died on it. People who have tried to calculate the odds of this suggest that the odds of this happening, and I cite this mathematical analysis in my book because I find it fascinating, you have about the same odds of this happening, of the 50th anniversary of July 4th, and two presidents to die on the same July 4th, which is the 50th day, and they're the two presidents who wrote the thing. By the way, the only other president to die on July 4th died 5 years later on July 4th, 1831. That was James Monroe, who was also a founding father, the 5th president of the United States. In any event, the odds of this happening are about the same odds as drawing a royal flush 45 times in a row. Okay? It's not normal. And that story, and one other story that I will tell very briefly, have to convince you that something is going on. I have 3 chapters in this book that are devoted to Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln is such a familiar figure. We sort of think that we know him and we know what he looks like. We really lose the sense, unless you go back into the guts of the story, just how weird everything about Abraham Lincoln is. It's incredibly weird. It is utterly illogical that he ever became president. And not just because he grew up poor. He didn't own shoes. He didn't have formal education at all. He went to school a total of 6 months. He did not come from a distinguished background. He came from the most disadvantaged imaginable background. And he wasn't a successful politician. He wasn't a famous billionaire or TV reality star or former Secretary of State or former U.S. Senator. Heck, Lincoln ran for Senate 3 times and lost every darn time. He won only one major race. He was elected to the U.S. Congress for a single term. And then he went to Congress and he opposed the Mexican War, destroyed his local popularity, and so goes his national political career. The fact that he was nominated is a miracle. The fact that he won is a miracle. But even more than that, who he was. And the journey that he took from being a religious skeptic who, because of the same faith in America as a predestined land of promise, not promised land, but land of promise, that made Lincoln simply amazing. And one of the 3 stories that I tell about Lincoln that I highlight in the book involves the Emancipation Proclamation. In the summer of 1862, he drafts it by himself, no speechwriter, no presidential assistant. He drafts the Emancipation Proclamation. He reads it to his cabinet. And Secretary Seward, who was his principal advisor, the Secretary of State, who was not an Exxon oil executive, but he was a U.S. Senator and a former governor of New York, fairly remarkable guy in his own right, said, no, Mr. President, you cannot issue this proclamation now. We have lost battle after battle after battle. They had just lost the Battle of Second Bull Run. They had lost the Peninsular Campaign. They lost the Battle of Bull Run. The Federal Army was beaten at every turn by the rebels, by the Southerners, by the Confederates. You cannot issue this proclamation. And Lincoln agreed. And he told his cabinet he would put it in his drawer and wait for a sign. And wait for a sign from where? From God, from Providence, from the forces that controlled this world. sign came in an unlikely way. Robert E. Lee is invading the North, marching at the head of the triumphant Army of Northern Virginia, in some descriptions, the most formidable man-for-man fighting force ever. The guys were motivated, their morale was high, they had won victory after victory. Now they're invading the North to end the war, to secure the defense of the Confederacy, of states' rights, and yes, of slavery. The Union Army, there's a switch in generals. All of a sudden, Lincoln brings back General McClellan. About McClellan, you can truly say he was a legend in his own mind. And you read the letters that McClellan wrote at the time, his sense of grandeur and his own importance, it's insufferable. And he referred to Lincoln in letters to his wife regularly as the original guerrilla. And he was a man highly educated, highly polished. Lincoln was this backwoods lawyer. Lincoln brought him back, after having fired him before, brought him back to lead the army to try to stop this invasion of the North, which was going to end the war. Britain is on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy, which would make it a member of the family of nations, the first new member of the family of nations, based upon the principle of chattel slavery at its very core. The 44th Indiana Volunteers are marching all night as part of this effort to intercept the Confederate invasion. They arrive at the town of Frederick, Maryland. They lie down in a grassy open field, and a 42-year-old corporal named Barton K. Mitchell waits while his buddy, a guy named Sergeant John McKnight Bloss, is brewing some coffee on a campfire. One of their very few pleasures. And then there's another pleasure. Just as Corporal Mitchell is lying down, stretching out, he reaches out with his left hand, and it touches something in the tall grass in the field where they are. And what it touches are 3 cigars. They're unsmoked. They look pretty good. He starts asking for a light, and his buddy, Sergeant Bloss, says, wait a minute, what's those papers they were wrapped in? They look at the papers, covered with dense handwriting, and it says on the top, General Order 181. Okay, this looks serious. And it is signed by Adjutant General R.H. Chilton, Chief of Staff Robert E. Lee. Whoa. They take it to their captain. He takes it to the major. They go on and on and on up the line with these orders because this could be important. Meanwhile, the cigars are lost, which is considered a tragedy. The 3 most important cigars in American history. They take General Order 181, the famous Lost Dispatch, they take it to General McClellan. McClellan has the good sense to interrupt a council with his associated generals to look at these papers. He said it must be a fraud. It must be a fake. Bobby Lee is trying to set a trap for me. And because this can't really be this information that has the layout of all his troops and all his plans. And all of a sudden, he says, this was written by Lieutenant Colonel Chilton, the adjutant to General Lee. And someone comes up, he says, I know that Chilton from the regular army. Why? Well, it's just one of these amazing stories. There's again a guy named Sam Pittman who is on McClellan's staff. He says he was stationed out in Detroit. He was working at a bank in Detroit, Michigan. There was a small army base. Chilton used to come in all the time to fill out deposits. He says, I know his handwriting. He looks at the handwriting, says, I'm sure that's authentic. So McClellan clutches this. He says, with this paper, if I don't beat Bobby Lee, it's time to go home. The Battle of Antietam follows. The invasion of the North is stopped. Lincoln gets his sign and tells the cabinet, and 2 cabinet members write it down, I have received the sign I have been waiting for, and now he will free the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation follows. There is not the possibility of believing that this is random chance. And this is the basic argument in the book. Yes, you can say one thing or another thing, or this thing or that thing, or these various stories, or the fact that gold was discovered in California in the same week that the United States of America got title to California, which we did only because there was a clerk in the State Department named Nicholas Trist who defied President Polk, risked arrest. He had been fired by the president. He was not supposed to be representing the U.S. He signed the papers anyway with Mexico, and he signed the papers with Mexico not knowing that 1,600 miles away, at that very moment, they were discovering gold. Okay. You can say it's all a pattern of happy accidents. A pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern. And that is what emerges with tremendous clarity in the American story. One of the things that I learned in writing The American Miracle was this. The profound truth that you can find in a book that was revered by our founders, even those who rejected it, and there were some. It's called the Bible. In the book of Exodus, in Exodus 33, Moses wants to see God's face. He wants to see God's glory. He says, God, show me your glory. God says, no man may look on it and live. I will show you my back. He hides Moses in a cleft in the rock, and then he can see God's back. The traditional understanding in our Jewish tradition of that very, very strange passage is that it is possible to see history after it happens and to understand it in a way that it is impossible to understand it as it is happening. To bring us back to Otto von Bismarck, I can't resist. It's such a good quote. Bismarck says in another place, it is the job of the statesman to listen for God's footsteps marching through history, and then to grab onto his coattails and hang on. That's our job. All of our patriotic songs, really all of them, if you look at the second, third, fourth verses sometimes, they all mention God. They all mention the idea that this has been a God-entangled land. We are so fortunate. And if you deny the providential nature of the American miracle, you're left with really ruling out the idea of a pattern of happy accidents, which is still a pattern. You're left with only one other idea, which is that America got to be the dominant power in the world from being a string of very random, thinly settled settlements clinging to the eastern seaboard, that we got to be the dominant power in the world because we were rapacious, we were cruel, we were exploitative, we were dominant. Oh, we were so cruel and so horrible and so guilty. Here's the problem. There were a lot of other countries that were much worse, particularly colonial powers like Spain and Portugal and France and even Holland. Far more harsh, far more bloody than anything that the British colonists who became Americans ever did. They didn't succeed. We did. We did. And may we continue to succeed. And with the continuation of providential protection and the understanding that that blessing confers not special privileges, but special burdens and special responsibilities. May we continue to cherish and to nourish this greatest nation on God's green earth. Thank you very much. All right, let's if we can, go to some questions.
Thanks
Go
for
ahead.
what you do, Michael.
Thank you.
Michael, Which concepts and ideas from your message of the American miracle would you most like to share with Seattle's high school students?
That's a great question. And let me say this, that the appropriate response to American history is not guilt, it's gratitude. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that America has been a perfect nation. American exceptionalism doesn't mean American perfectionism. And the idea that we have been specially protected in this country doesn't mean we've always deserved it. There are times when we manifestly have not, and there are issues on which we manifestly have not. But one of the problems with so much of what you get in education today, particularly history education, is this long litany of complaints about America. America despoiled the environment, and Native Americans lived here in perfect harmony with nature, which, by the way, is not true. And that things were at peace and like at Eden, and then the white man came and everything was ruined and everything was spoiled and everyone was exploited and everything was cruel and everything was miserable. Okay, that's wrong. It's also wrong on the other side to say that from the very moment that people first came to Jamestown that they were righteous and they were good and everything lived in harmony. It's history. But the important point that I would share with the high school students is that history is more exciting, more meaningful, and more true when you focus on the heroic and when you focus on things that truly are amazing in terms of giving us this good life that we should appreciate. And the idea that the study of history should lead people to not a special burden of guilt, but a special sense of responsibility and a special sense of the capacity in America to lead these amazing lives. America's always been the land of new life, the land of fresh starts. That's why people came here. That's why they crossed big oceans. That's why they left home. That's why my grandfather came. That's why the Pilgrims came. They wanted to start again. By the way, do you know one of the things, and this in itself is very important for Thanksgiving, right? I really do care very much that people get this right. The Pilgrims did not come here because they were fleeing religious persecution. They teach this in schools, and it's nonsense. Anybody remember, where did the Pilgrims come here from? Holland, the most religiously tolerant country in the world. There was no religious persecution in Holland. They came here seeking righteousness and seeking a perfectible society, not simply seeking freedom from persecution. And the idea that there has been a general arc. Dr. King, whose birthday you're going to be celebrating January 15th here at Town Hall, Dr. King says the moral arc of the universe bends upward. The moral arc of American history most certainly does. And teaching that to kids, the idea that what we really need to do is not focus on reasons to feel guilty, but reasons to feel grateful would be the primary message.
Hello, Michael. Thanks for doing this tonight.
Thank you, Corey. Sure.
I have a two-part question. To me, one of the clearest signs of God's touching America is the history of George Washington, particularly when he was a lieutenant colonel in Braddock's campaign. So the first part of my question is, what do you think is the most spectacular sign of God's will in the life of George Washington? And secondly, and you may not have an answer for this, can you think of anything at all similar in the life of General Mattis?
The second part of the question first. I don't know General Mattis's personal history. I mean, I know he's from Pullman, Washington. I think grew up in Richland. He's one of our own, a Washingtonian. Yay, team. And by the way, you'll notice that I'm wearing my husky purple tie in honor of the forthcoming confrontation with Alabama I mean, the Crimson Tide sounds like something that washes up on shore, right? I mean, this is not... Okay. So General Mattis, I wouldn't presume to speak about, but he, again, when you read stories about this guy and you hear from people, and I've spoken to people who have served with him, a remarkable man and a remarkable choice. And for people who are deeply skeptical about Mr. Trump, very, very reassuring that the Defense Department, which is arguably the most important appointment that he will make, that the appointment is one that is universally praised, I think is very encouraging. George Washington. I don't know if you've read this section of my book yet, but
I just got it tonight.
Good.
I've heard many of your stories over the years.
Right.
And I was always fascinated by what the Native Americans had to say about George Washington.
Correct. And I have the entire story about that, which is called the Indian Prophecy. And the story is unbelievable because it's very complicated. Our source for the Indian Prophecy is Dr. Craig, who was a lifelong friend of Washington's and who was an eyewitness to this story. The story is that apparently Washington went out before the Revolution. It was about 8 years after the Battle of Monongahela, which is also known as Braddock's Defeat, which is one of the worst days in the history of the British Army, where basically they marched into a trap along a road that they were trying to build and marching very slowly with heavy equipment. And the woods were filled with French sharpshooters and their Native American allies, some of them Native Canadian allies. And they shot at the British. There were 70 officers on horseback, British officers and American militia officers. 69 of them were either killed or seriously wounded. Only one of them was not harmed. His name was Washington. He was a 23-year-old lieutenant colonel and of the militia. And Washington was a big, juicy target. He was 6'3". At a time when the typical American, the typical person was 5'6". He stood out. He had two mounts shot out from under him. And basically to survive after your horse is shot and falls and you fall and the chances of breaking a leg, he survived. He showed his clothes after the battle. There were 4 bullet holes in his clothing, including his hat was shot off from his head. Okay, and this was so striking at the time that Samuel Davies, a famous pastor, and this is the very end of 1755, long before the Revolution, Washington's 23, that Samuel Davies, future president of Princeton University, famous pastor, delivers a sermon and says that surely Providence has protected that magnificent youth, Colonel Washington, and sustained him for some singular service to his people. Okay, this is pretty striking, yeah. Now, it gets more. And the chapter about George Washington is entitled Indestructible, Indispensable. And he was. At many, many points, you can see the entire history of the world being changed if bullets go a little bit this way, a little bit that way. Washington, before this Battle of Monongahela, he was coming back from having delivered an ultimatum to the French, and he had all of these adventures which I describe based upon his own recollections and the recollections of his companions. He had 2 companions, 1 companion for part of the journey and 2 companions for part of it. At one point, they were thrown into the ice, and he miraculously survived, and this is in December, and it's in a river in western Pennsylvania, and it's cold. And they survived, but they were fording the river with rafts that they had created, and an ice floe came and knocked them in. And at one point, an Indian came out of the woods and offered to help them and to guide them, and saw that Washington's companion was carrying a heavy musket, and the Indian offered, "Oh, I'd be very glad to carry your musket for you," and took the musket, and then immediately took aim at Washington. and fired at him from, they think, about 10 feet away. It was close. And as I say in the book, at this moment, if someone were making a movie about this, and they should, you would see the bullet in slow motion as the entire history of the world depends upon this bullet missing its great big 6'3" target, and it did. And it goes on. During the Revolution, it was well known that Washington could not be shot. He rode at the lead of his troops at the Battle of Monmouth. They were shooting at him. Patrick Ferguson, who was the most famous marksman in the British Army, had a chance to plug Washington from a nest of snipers before the Battle of Brandywine, but for inexplicable reasons said that felt distasteful to him and didn't want to do it. So, yeah, the Indian prophecy. This guy, Dr. Craig, shared an account with the closest thing to a descendant that George Washington had. His name was Custis, and Washington never had children. This is another thing that you think about. Isn't that strange, the father of our country? Right? And the reason that people believed, and I believe, that Washington, I am just as much a descendant of George Washington as anybody. So are you, so are you, so are you, so is everybody. Because he never had children of his own. He did have a stepchild. He had 2 stepchildren. And he had step-grandchildren because Martha was a widow when he married Martha. And one of his step-grandchildren wrote this play and wrote out the Indian prophecy. And this is Washington is going together with his friend Dr. Craig. They're going for an expedition in the woods. And an Indian comes out of the woods with a whole group of people. He's an aged chief. And he says he came here because he wanted to meet the great chief, the tall one. That would be Washington. And then he tells this story from an Indian point of view, which is in the book as it was transcribed by Washington's step-grandson, about the Indians concluding their bullets were useless against this one. That on that day, the day of the great battle, they couldn't miss, but they were powerless against George Washington. It's spooky stuff, and it struck people at the time. It should strike us today. Washington died at the very end, this time of year, a few days after this, but just 2 weeks before the end of the century he dominated. He died in 1799 in December. Go ahead.
Mr. Medved, thanks for your lifetime of scholarship and patriotism.
Thank you.
It's given us so many years of enlightenment and entertainment. If God shed his tender mercies on the U.S., did he do it on Rome and Persia and Alhambra, maybe?
Something as big as Rome, something as big as the Persian Empire, you could say that there is something bigger involved there. I was very influenced, and okay, this is geek stuff, but and nerd stuff. When I was 16, I discovered my favorite book of all time, which is, and still is, and there really is no better novel ever written. It's War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy. And Tolstoy writes based on the ideas of Hegel about the will of history, which is, you can say that all of this is a random accident, or that it's Napoleon woke up one day and he felt like, yeah, let's invade Russia, which is what happens in War and Peace. He said, yeah, okay, if some mujik, if some Russian peasant wakes up and says, yeah, I want to invade France today, it doesn't matter. That what you're talking about is so many hundreds of thousands, millions of people who have to make these individual decisions, and they all amount to something very, very big. Yeah, we're talking about big stuff. And if you believe that God didn't just make the watch and then set the watch and then let it unspool, if you believe that God is directly involved, then big things in human history, I think, represent something of the will of God, a will of history, if you will. But clearly that timetable has been heightened. The Roman Empire was so cruel in so many ways, so horribly corrupt. And you could say that corruption became vastly worse after the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the empire. And I think that the other aspect of things is they were pagans, so they did not believe in one controlling force in the universe, which it seems to me is one of the big differences between our point of view in the United States and the point of view of ancient civilizations like the Persian civilization that you mentioned, or you could mention the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Romans and the Greeks. The idea that there was one script, one plan, one guiding hand was foreign to them. And it was not foreign to our leaders. That's one of the striking things, and one of the things I think you'll see from this book that will amaze you, is that even those founding fathers, even those great American leaders, who we don't associate as being conventionally Christian or religious at all, believed that God was guiding the United States. Jefferson knew it. And by the way, it played a role. One of the chapters in the book is called Providential Purchase. How is it that Napoleon Bonaparte, who has the biggest appetite for gobbling up land of anybody in human history, all of a sudden gives away this huge tract of land? It's the site of 15 states, and he gives it away for a song. America didn't even ask for it. We wanted to buy this little town of New Orleans, which had 5,000 people in it. Napoleon says, yeah, you want New Orleans? How about the whole kit and caboodle, 15 states, the whole Louisiana Purchase, at the price of about a penny an acre? Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, when he heard this news, said there is an air of enchantment to it. And Alexander Hamilton, who, if you've seen the musical, you know he wasn't such a holy Joe. He wasn't a religious guy particularly. He said, unquestionably, this is providence. He says the same providence that guided us so firmly during the Revolution, that made this purchase possible. And that would be, it seems to me, the big difference, is you don't really see that in terms of one script. What you see is the Greek vision that you read in the Odyssey or the Iliad, more specifically, of the gods fighting against each other, not the idea of one God who is the God of all and of all time.
Well, I want to tie my question to your topic. So I think it's also providential that America had these founding geniuses like Hamilton, you just mentioned, and Madison and others, who formulated an almost perfect constitution. It's not perfect, but it certainly works better than any other system. And so I have an acquaintance who's a middle school teacher in Portland who on his Facebook page made a comment after the election that, they kicked out the elites, that is, the people who stayed awake in civics class. And I resented that a little bit. And I was at a dinner conversation, a little dinner conversation debate with some others, and told him about this. And I said, I think that the Rust Belt guy, the machinist in Michigan, and the truck driver in Tennessee have a better innate sense of how the government works and of civics, perhaps, than this middle school teacher. And of course, my interlocutor in the debate said, no, they were just out of a job. That's why they voted for Trump. And you know what? I'm still going to stick by my side because we have people like you in talk radio who are teaching civics. And I think part of the reason Trump won, providential or not, was that people sensed that the government had gotten a little out of control, that the president was using diktats, to govern, where he should have used worked with the legislature, and the Justice Department and the IRS were completely out of control. So I think the common man did have an understanding of civics. So I wonder what your opinion of that argument is.
Well, again, you're probably familiar with William F. Buckley, who I had the privilege of knowing a little bit before we lost him, and I think was indubitably a great man, made this wonderful comment where he said, I would much rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory chosen at random than the 2,000 members of the Harvard faculty. Now Buckley could say that because, like me, he's a Yale man. But you see, there is fundamental truth in that. And that is basically, by the way, it's not a fundamental truth that would have been recognizable to James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or John Adams, because the franchise was strictly limited at that time. Do you know, most people don't know this, at the time of the Constitution, there were 6 states that had religious tests for voting. Only Protestants could vote. Catholics were not allowed to vote, let alone Jews or atheists. Only Protestant Christians were allowed to vote in New Hampshire. And again, this was before they federalized the First Amendment with the 14th Amendment. And so in any event, there was a different point of view on the part of the founders, and let me get back to that in just a moment. I think what you've said is profound, and I think you're right. That basically everybody talked in this election about the appetite for change. And I think that people voted for Trump because they were bored and frustrated, and they didn't like it, and they were tired of hearing the same complaints and the same drift in the same direction. And it was basically, okay, let's knock down all the chess pieces and start over. And I think Mr. Trump, with his selections in the cabinet so far, by and large, is trying to give people what they want. This is going to be different. But the sense of inevitability, the sense of predictability, it's gone. And I think the fact is that one reason that I believe the mood in the country is better, people are paying attention. They're kind of interested. Now, do I think that Mr. Trump is going to usher in a new golden age and, quote, make America great again? I think America was great before. But is it possible that we will be greater and that there will be a sense and a strengthening, particularly people like our questioner here, that that we are not following some kind of inevitable decline? I do think that's dissipating. You can feel it dissipating. And yes, there are people in the center, and there are people on the left, and there are some people on the right who are terribly worried about what Trump could do. But basically, I think our country's better than that. And this is the one area where I do tend to disagree a lot with a lot of Mr. Trump's most enthusiastic supporters. This is not a country that is going to rise or fall on the strength of one leader. And I think that part of what we are seeing may involve a reinvigoration of American politics to get more people involved, to pay attention. I think what's fascinating is a lot of those demonstrators who were out there at Trump Tower and talking about the end of the world and in the streets and crying, and they didn't vote, right? They didn't vote. And certainly not enough of them voted in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Florida to make a difference. By the way, but Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all 1% margins. Voting is important and participation is important. Let me go back to one other thing about the founders, and then we'll take another question, and then we can wrap up. But speaking about the founders and this remarkable group of people, and it is, I mean, if you think about it, okay, we live in a very big country, all right? We're 330 million people. You know how many people lived in the United States of America at the time of the Constitution? It's about 3.5 million. And about 1/10 of those people were slaves. So we're talking about 1/100th of the population. And you have Franklin, Hamilton, Madison, Adams, Jefferson, John Jay, I mean, Aaron Burr, for better or worse. These are big people. John Marshall. I mean, John Marshall in law school once upon a time did have the opportunity of going to law school, and yes, I was in law school with Bill and Hillary Clinton, and you can ask me later if they inhaled. No, it's incredible. Can you think of, if you think of the big six of the revolutionary leaders, you know, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, Adams, Franklin. Okay, who do you put them up against today? It's a much bigger country. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Okay, so you could say that this explains why America seems as if it were designed. It was designed by really remarkable people. The country didn't just evolve, it was intelligent design, you'll pardon the phrase, right? The question is, who was the designer? And those guys, all of them, did not claim to be the authors of the design. They claimed to be its instruments. Which is why you see at the end of the Declaration of Independence with a firm reliance on divine providence. And this is amazingly consistent even among people who were religiously unconventional, who were not churchgoers, who were not typical churchy people. People like Thomas Paine even, who was anti-religious in some respects, and Jefferson, who ripped out those parts of his Bible that he didn't like, and that was a lot of it. And Franklin, who was a theist, but Franklin gave this amazing speech which was transcribed by James Madison, written down in hand when Franklin spoke. He was 81 years old. He spoke at the Constitutional Convention. And it is the most amazing speech. I have the whole thing in my book. And you'll read it, and I hope, try reading it aloud, because it will make the hair stand up on your forearms. He gives a plea at a time when the Constitutional Convention is about to break up. They're about to go home and drop this whole idea of creating a new constitution, and he brings them back together by saying, we have to begin each session with prayer. We have forgotten to pray. This is the unconventional Franklin, and he says, and I use it as one of the epigraphs in the book, if a sparrow cannot fall without his notice, can an empire rise without his aid? It's profound, and it's so moving. And again, he's 81 years old. By the way, they drank a lot. They were not Mormons or Baptists at the Constitutional Convention. There were some Baptists there, but they drank in those days, or many of them did. One of the things that's fascinating, and again, I was stunned by this in the research, was some of the wine bills. And they liked Madeira wine, which is very sweet. And maybe that was the real miracle at Philadelphia, is that they got all this done when they were so soused. All right, another question. Many others did come over to the United States to flee religious persecution. The colony of Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, who's one of the more amazing figures, who had become a convert to the Quaker faith, which was considered sort of the hippies of the time. And they were ruthlessly persecuted, not only in Old England, but in New England. They banned Quakers from being in Massachusetts. So there was some very serious religious persecution. Maryland was founded by the Calvert family, who were Catholics, who were suffering religious persecution by the Church of England authorities. So you're 100% right. There were many people who did come. My point was not the Pilgrims, but go ahead. We should understand that, of course, the phrase wall of separation between church and state does not come from anything in the Constitution. It doesn't come from anything in the Bill of Rights. It doesn't come from anything in legal documents of the United States. It comes from a letter that President Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists in 1805, where they were writing to President Jefferson because at the time Baptists in America suffered some serious persecution. And there were parts of the country where Baptists were having a tough time being allowed to vote and participate as full citizens. And Jefferson wrote back and used this term, wall of separation. And then in a later Supreme Court case, they cited that term and injected that into our jurisprudence. But the key thing to remember from Jefferson's original intention and from all of the subsequent jurisprudence, the main idea of a wall of separation is not to protect government against religion. It's to protect religion from government, right? I mean, the idea is Jefferson was not worried that there would be religious attempts to take over the government and to impose one religious standard. That, by the way, is why the First Amendment is worded the way it is. It's so important that people know this. The First Amendment doesn't say anything about a wall of separation between church and state. What it says is, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or limiting the free exercise thereof. That is why what you learn in law school, first year con law, class I was in with Hillary Clinton, they actually emphasize there are two different parts of the First Amendment. There is the no establishment clause and the free exercise clause. And sometimes they run against one another. But the basic point that has allowed America to enjoy this amazing religious freedom, which is totally unprecedented, I mean, it's totally unprecedented in the history of the world, has been the fact that we have a free market of ideas here. This is where John Adams was wrong and Jefferson and Madison were right. John Adams was in favor of taxpayer support of churches. And bad idea. Because then you start arguing about which church do we support and which one is the official church. England still has an established church. The Church of England is the official Church of England. It's supported by the government. It is. Nobody goes, but it's supported by the government. When I say nobody goes, in America, most recent survey, Pew Research Service, 36% of Americans go to church at least once a week or more. 36%, a lot of people. In Britain, the number's 5%. We have this magnificent tapestry of religion, and it's free competition. And yes, you can get into arguments at universities, you can get into arguments on buses, if you can hear yourself. You can get into arguments anywhere with people, and you have the freedom to try to convert people and to argue with them, and basically, you can choose. And that's another amazing thing. In America today, about half of the people who describe themselves as religious are in a different denomination, at least, than the one in which they were raised. There's lots of that going on. I bet if I took a show of hands, are there people here who are in different denominations or religious groupings than the ones in which you were raised? Yeah, I mean, it's extremely common in the United States. And it's glorious. And it's why religion is so much stronger here than it is in other parts of the world where there is no religious liberty. And this goes to your point. The Establishment Clause, I think, is very, very firm. Is that the Establishment Clause does not mean that the United States must embrace a state religion of atheism or a state religion of secularism. And they've worked this out pretty well in the Congress of the United States. They basically, you know that Congress today pays attention to Benjamin Franklin. By the way, when Benjamin Franklin called for opening every day with prayer, what happened? They dropped it. They said no. You know why? Not because they thought prayer was a bad idea. They thought it was a good idea. They couldn't afford it. They were out of money. They had no money in the budget. And they were worried that they would have to pay pastors. And that was a point that Hamilton made. He wasn't even Secretary of the Treasury yet. He just said, how could we? Okay. The point about this is that in the Congress of the United States, they do have chaplains who come in. They have people who come in. And it used to be there would always be a chaplain of the House and a chaplain of the Senate would be one guy. Now they have everything. They've had imams. They've had Buddhist priests. They've had Buddhist monks. They've had every imaginable kind of rabbi. They've had people from every denomination. And it's beautiful. And by the way, this is one of those wonderful things that the Freedom from Religion Foundation is pushing for, is they want somebody atheist to lead prayer one morning. And you know what? As long as he doesn't use it to attack other religions, right? Why not? Why not? And this has been the great strength of our country. I often ask people, because people say what you're saying all the time is, well, what if the Christian right takes over? What are you afraid of? Oh, what kind of takeover? I have not heard anyone who wants, for instance, to enforce biblical law. Okay, I shouldn't say anyone. It's a big country. But it's such a tiny percentage of people. Really, you want to have the death penalty for adultery? Look, it would solve the population problems that people think they're population problems. But it's one of those things where did we have religious freedom in this country when they began the day in the state of New York with the New York State Regent's Prayer, it was called? You know what the text of the prayer was? Dear God, we thank you for this day, for this school, for our parents, and for our beloved country. Amen. Okay, is that so terrible? I'm not sure that's constitutionally forbidden. Right now it is, but we'll see what the Supreme Court decides. What I can absolutely assure you is we are not going to go back to the situation where any state can disfranchise people based upon religious faith. And that any fears that people have of trying to impose a theocracy, it seems to me, are false fears. In just a few minutes left, thank you very much for your question. Anything else? Any last question here? And then we can wrap up in just a moment. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I love talking about this book. And I may have mentioned to you that there is a second book on the way under contract from the same publisher, from the good people at Random House. Crown Forum is the name of the sub-publisher. This is my fourth book in a row with the same folks, and they're great folks. And the new book is called This Favored Land. And the subtitle will be either More American Miracles or perhaps Continued Providential Protection. And there are stories that just need to be told. The Battle of Midway, right? Which is completely inexplicable, and these guys who were in the Battle of Midway couldn't understand it. 4 minutes. They sank 3 Japanese carriers in 4 minutes and crippled the 4th, so it couldn't be used. And it was miraculous, and they said it was as if something was guiding our bombs. It was one sortie from an aircraft carrier. And by the way, without the Battle of Midway, that was the turning point in World War II, one of the great decisive battles in history. Franklin Roosevelt recognized the role of Providence. And one of the things that the second book is going to feature is his D-Day prayer, which is so profoundly religious. I mean, today, if a president spoke like that, the president said that he delivered a prayer, Dear God, dear Lord, protect our young men. And he said in the course of that prayer, who were fighting for Christianity and civilization. Okay, it's astonishing. And this is FDR, who, imperfect individual in many ways. But again, so are we all. And so are all those people who have been used by the God of history in preserving and promoting the United States of America. I would just come back in conclusion to the one point that I think which is most important, is when you hear, okay, Medved's theme is that God has special protection for America. It doesn't make Americans better it makes us more obligated. Because, again, to those to whom much is given, much is expected. What is it that Spider-Man's motto, with great power comes great responsibility? And America has to demonstrate that. One of the wonderful quotes that I found and that is featured at the conclusion of this book is a quote from a historian named Walter McDougall, who taught for many years American history at my father's alma mater at the University of Pennsylvania. And Professor McDougall says, try to imagine some kind of mystical time traveler, some kind of Flying Dutchman ship, some kind of lost ship, where someone comes into our world from the year, say, 1616. It's not that long ago, 400 years ago. And the guy looks around the world, and let's see, we have Islam, aggressive, angry in much of the world in 1616, fighting with various sects in Islam, and with a sense of grudge against the West. You have China, vast empire with tremendous possibilities, a great sense of its own superiority, and yet not much real power. The French think they're superior to everybody else, and particularly in cultural matters, and they did then. You look around the world, Russia, vast potential. And what you could say about Russia in 1616 and what you can say about Russia in 2016 is what some people say about Brazil. Russia is the country of the future, and it always will be. And you look around the world, and the only part of the world where there's something that this time traveler from 1616 will absolutely not recognize, it, it's here. It's the United States. No one would have thought in 1616 that the dominant civilization on Earth, in terms of military might, in terms of economic power, in terms of cultural influence, would be in North America. I mean, even in terms of the Indian civilizations, yes, there were Indian tribes and cultures throughout North America, but none of them comparable to these massive and advanced civilizations that the Aztecs built and the Incas built and the Mayans built. The Mayans even disappeared before before the Europeans. Pardon me, the Mayans were human. Even disappeared before the Europeans got here. So who would have expected America? He says this is why the development, the emergence of the United States of America is by far the most significant historical development of the last 400 years. And the development of this country has changed the course of everything, everywhere. The ideas that this country put forth, the influence that this country put forth. And everyone is part of the American experience. Let me try one more story from the book, and it's one of those stories that I really didn't know before I did this book. It's a story of somebody whose name you may have heard, but you may not know a lot about him. The guy's name is Sam Houston. I don't know if there are other Sam Houston fans here, but I became a great fan of Sam Houston. His father was a Virginian. They moved out to the frontier in North Carolina. And Sam's father died when he was young. And Sam went out, and actually when he was a very young man, they had a little country store, and he was supposed to tend store. And according to some reports, Sam was a big guy. Some people say he was 6'6", he was at least 6'2". Either way, he was a giant for that time. And he wasn't really made for keeping store. So he runs away and goes off to live with the Cherokee Indians. And he's adopted by the Cherokees. And they give him a name, Colonel, which is the raven. And he loves Cherokee ways. He took with him one of the things that he had inherited from his father, which is a book and translation of the Iliad. And he's teaching the Indians Homer and living happily there, and he continues to live with the Indians. until he volunteers to fight in the War of 1812. And he becomes a conspicuously successful warrior and serves under a rather remarkable general named Andrew Jackson, forming a lifelong devotion and friendship with Jackson. In any event, to take a very long story and make it a little bit tolerable, Sam Houston advances in politics, becomes a general of the militia. He becomes a congressman from Tennessee. And then he's elected at age 34, which is pretty young, as the governor of Tennessee. And President Jackson says pretty much to everybody, next president. He's his protege. Jackson is incredibly popular. Only one problem. You got to run for president, you got to find a wife. And Houston wrote in one letter, he said, I don't know what's wrong with the girls. They weren't cottoning to Governor Houston. He's the governor of Tennessee. He's finally set up with supposedly the most beautiful girl in the state. And it's a storybook wedding. But Houston is involved with these omens and these messages from his Indian spirituality. And his spirit bird, remember, is the raven. He is called Kelowna. That is his Indian name, his Cherokee name. And on his way to his wedding, a raven drops dead in front of his horse as he's riding out to this wedding ceremony, and he took it as a bad omen. In any event, this is the most disastrous wedding night in American history. And there are all kinds of theories about what actually happened between General Houston, Governor Houston, and his young bride. And what we do know happened is that the next morning she said she hated him and wanted to kill him. The wedding night did not go well. The result was that the new First Lady of Tennessee leaves Governor Houston, and he is forced to resign because of the humiliation. He resigns, he runs off, he goes back to live with the Indians, but he has a new Indian name. It's not the Raven now. His new Indian name is Big Drunk, because he's drinking heavily and drinking his life away. And a combination of circumstances lead him, encouraged by President Jackson, to try to start a new life that would have been impossible to him. He goes back to Washington at one point because he's been insulted by a congressman, this gigantic guy named William Stanberry. He's like 300 pounds at the time. And there's only one photograph of him, and he looks like Jabba the Hutt. And Stanberry has accused Houston of stealing from the Treasury and stealing from the Indians. And so Houston finds him in the street in one of his trips to Washington and starts beating him with a hickory cane, where he'd cut the hickory rod from a piece of hickory tree in Andrew Jackson's estate, the Hermitage in Tennessee. Stanberry fires at Sam Houston point blank at his heart. The gun misfires. Houston eventually finds his way to Texas. And now there's an eagle riding before him that's leading him across the border into Texas. He arrives in Texas just in time to take command of the Texas military forces in the Texas War for Independence. The Texas War for Independence was a great big disaster. Everybody's massacred at the Alamo. Prisoners are shot, killed. In Goliad, 900 Americans are captured and all killed. And Santa Anna, who described himself as the Napoleon of the West and the savior of the motherland, is determined to capture General Houston and kill what are called the Texians. In any event, 18 minutes of conflict. He wins the Battle of San Jacinto. If the Battle of San Jacinto doesn't happen, Texas and New Mexico and Arizona are still part of Mexico. And you could say, well, so what? Is it that so terrible? Well, no, but it's a very different America. And the idea that Houston had about God leading him every step of this way, if that wedding night had gone better, he would have continued as governor of Tennessee and would have probably found his way to Washington, and there wouldn't be an independent Texas. The stories of the Battle of San Jacinto and how that happened against all odds, against a far superior force. Unbelievably amazing. And again, everyone at the time, including the Mexicans who were defeated, seeing in it something supernatural. We have been enormously blessed. This country that we have is the product of so many breaks. If you are playing poker, and there's somebody sitting across the table from you, and he wins every darn hand, you kind of figure either he's cheating or it's a rigged game. Yeah, it's a rigged game. I believe that it has been rigged in behalf of the United States of America. Now it's up to us to continue to merit that favor and to do everything that we have been given. I thank you so much for your attention. It's a pleasure to be here at Town Hall. Thank you.